From Code to the Cloud cuts through the noise to get to what really matters, the insights and tactics that help you maintain a consistently secure and productive DevOps strategy.
Welcome to From Code to the Cloud, a DevSecOps podcast focused on the Salesforce ecosystem. I'm Andrew Davis, founder of the Institute for Transformational Leadership and author of the book Flow Engineering. And my guest today is John Crimmings, a DevOps consultant at Slalom Consulting and also a member of the Low Code Security Alliance. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Andrew. I'm really happy to be here.
Well, you and I have gone way back, relatively, a bunch of years, and very much appreciated you've been one of the main contributors to the Low Code Security Alliance in terms of your thought and your exploration. Do you want to just give us a brief background on your history, your career, your areas of focus within Salesforce space?
Sure. I've been in Salesforce space for almost 10 years. I started a little bit late in my career, kind of found my way to software development after some time in financial journalism and radio before that. And after getting a certificate in software development, JavaScript, I found my way into Salesforce and had a great mentor and was able to, get a full range of hands-on experience and eventually made my way to consulting at Slalom. And I love the ability to sort of help clients with problems related to Salesforce. I like the constant changing environments, the industries, different types of clients. I think it's really great to make connections between those things. And it's an exciting space to be in.
And I spent a number of years as a consultant. I also really appreciated, you're getting a new client all the time. So you're learning fairly broadly about different industries and different technical challenges. When you and I first connected, I think I learned that you had a degree in philosophy. And I think if I'm recalling correctly, and there's been something very thoughtful I've felt always about your approach, both to DevOps and then also to security, as we've had more recent discussions. When I think about philosophy, I think about, among other things, logic and ethics being key aspects, right? The logic of, including the logic of seeing through spurious arguments and seeing through unreasonable, unrealistic claims, and then the underlying ethical orientation of what's actually best for customers, what's actually best for clients, is what's being said in alignment with that. Is that? I'm seeing you nod. I'm getting some resonance with that.
Yeah, I think there's a sort of a rationality bone inside me, inside of a lot of people, and I think in Salesforce, a lot of times you see things that don't always feel rational, and you want to sort that order and you want to put it into place, and you want things to make sense and make logical sense. And I think that's an interesting connection that you've made for some of the paths that I've taken within Salesforce. I think, you and I met through DevOps interest, and I think there is a great place to be in if you want to bring order and rationality to Salesforce is the release management, the application lifecycle. And I think that's probably part of why I've really was drawn to it. And even now security, I think it's bringing order in from chaos.
And the ethics aspect, if somebody enumerates, the things that are studied and looked at in philosophy, it looks a little bit abstract. But the ethics is basically, do you actually care about your clients? Do you actually care about them getting the good results? And if you really care about them, then the logic bit becomes really important. Like, will this actually work? We've got a bunch of decisions we're making. Are things going to unfold the way we think it's going to unfold? Are we actually going to get the results that we're hoping to get?
I think it's nice to think about, an ethical, moral philosophy. Sort of sometimes there's frameworks where you put yourself in the place of the least advantaged person and design a system for that. And I think in Salesforce, I'm sure I know for a fact my information is in a number of different Salesforce orgs, and so personally, so it's nice to sort of think about, okay, if I'm building an org or helping design an org from a security standpoint or an efficiency standpoint, what if my data is in there? What if, they're trying to help me get to the end of a problem that I'm having? Thinking of it that way, putting yourself as as somebody who might be in the org, I think that does ground the work a little bit in a more ethical grounding.
Yeah, both of our data is probably in more Salesforce orgs than we realize,
Yeah.
right? If to the degree either of us ever get automated phone calls or emails from folks, trying to get our attention, that probably is an indication. So that maybe brings us to, we were talking about Agentforce recently, and you had done a bunch of experimentation in terms of prompt engineering. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that, the context and your explorations?
Sure. Yeah, it started, I think I either read an article or listened to a podcast about prompt engineering. And it was not something that was on my radar. And I thought, oh, that's kind of fascinating. Wonder what you can do with Salesforce and Agentforce. And I hadn't really played around with Agentforce too much before doing this. And I just spun up an org with, that I could start playing around with it in, and just started asking questions. And just some context. When you create an org, an SDO org like I used for this, your user is assigned system admin, so by default. And the agent that you're assigned to is the employee agent. I think now it's called Agentforce, employee agent. And that means that the agent that you're using, the chat bot you're talking to, assumes your own permission, and so the user permission. So I just kind of playing around with Agentforce, asking it questions like, can you change my username? Can you change Andrew's username? Can you change Andrew's email address? I was, I think at first thinking like, this is crazy. Like I shouldn't be able to do this. But that sort of was, I think I was thinking that way because of how easy it was, right? Like this was a new way of interacting with Salesforce, a new interface for doing this work. It's not surprising because I am a system administrator. Like I can go into setup, I can change your username, I can change your email. There's multiple steps to do that. And at each step, there's sort of, delay built into the process to make sure that what you're doing is what you intend to do. And Agentforce out of box in this way provided a very streamlined way to do it. And I think that the ease in which you could do it was just reiterated sort of the fact that what we've discussed previously, as part of the low code security alliance is if you don't really know what you've given your users access to, now that you have a powerful, really quick, easy tool to manipulate your org, that opens up a whole new surface area for security problems to pop up.
And so sometimes when we think about prompt engineering, we're thinking about escalation of privileges, right? That you were not supposed to be able to do something, but somehow you jailbroke or I don't know if you say jailbroke, you broke out of the jail with the prompt engineering. You got some privileges you weren't supposed to have. And so you felt like it initially looked like you were getting that, and then you realized it was really it was reducing the friction in that process.
Yeah, I think it was reducing the friction. And I think I just wasn't, it's funny because as soon as you change the interface, you feel like you're doing something that you shouldn't be doing because you're talking to agent about it. But like I said, as a system administrator, it makes sense that those are things that would be granted to me. It's just as soon as you sort of change the paradigm in which you're doing it, that's when I think it made it seem more permissive than it actually is. But still, I think that awareness of that is really important because there's things that people could do. Just, I'm not sure the level of logging that you can get down to see who's doing this and when's doing it. And the ease in which you can do it can cause problems to compound pretty quickly, I think. Some other things that I was able to do just out of playing around was reassign people's profiles. Things that, like, again, I could do in setup, but just telling an agent to say, please change Andrew's profile to contract manager or minimum access. And it was pretty easy. And I mean, it can happen so quickly that it's just it's an area that I think people aren't fully aware can be done with Agentforce, and it's important. I think that it gets called out.
Nice. One thing that's coming to my mind is in when I was doing research, I wrote this book, Mastering Salesforce DevOps, once upon a time. And in the course of doing that, one of the metaphors that was really interesting to me was the metaphor of driving, right? And the because in DevOps, one of your goals is to accelerate the pace of software development. And that, I would say, is also one of the goals of low code development. You can accelerate what's possible. And AI-powered development, whether you're using, Agentforce for developers or just using Agentforce for employees or voice prompt for that, all of those things we could say that they're accelerating the pace of software development. And so there was a chart that I included in the book that was number of vehicle fatalities per 100,000 miles driven. And it's quite a beautiful chart because the numbers are ticking down very steadily over the last century, starting in let's say 1920, 1915, how many people died in automobiles per 100,000 miles driven. And the chart is pretty much sloping downwards. And
Yeah.
you've got these milestones, the invention of the seatbelt. In 1930 or whatever. Seatbelts become mandatory in 1970 or 80 or
Sure.
whatever. The invention of airbags become mandatory. This vehicle lane, whatever we have these days, the advanced driver safety devices, vehicle, lane shift warnings and so forth. And so what's happened, though, is that the number of miles people are driving keeps going up, right? And the
Yes.
number of people who are driving keeps going up. And with, GPS and so forth. And then so you've got these countervailing tendencies. You've got increased vehicle safety equipment, but then you've got more and more people texting while driving and more distractions. For me, all of that does point towards self-driving cars are going to be like eventually necessary to save us from ourselves. But I feel like we're at a very similar state in the software development world, right? The pace of development is increasing. The pace of building things in Salesforce is increasing, and the safety features are perhaps a long way off. It's a little bit like when you buy a car, the car salesman doesn't stay with you and say, you need to stay attentive. You shouldn't be
Yeah.
texting while driving, right? They give you the keys, you drive off the lot, and you're on your own. And now we imagine with these like Agentforce for employees, you can go twice as fast or 50% as fast. What are the risks with that? And how soon will we get the equivalent of airbags?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think about it'd be interesting to know like what level of accidents were made like seatbelts sort of like we should do this, right? Like what was the tolerance before that happened? Because I think like what's interesting about the Agentforce conversation right now is that there's a lot of really cool stuff that you can do with it, and I completely understand the interest. People are always wanting to see demos about what Agentforce can do or what AI can do, generative AI, anything like that. Um, Nobody is knocking down my door or our door to get a demo about security or talk about security, even though they're so closely related. I mean, if you follow Agentforce through the kind of cool factor into like improving your processes and surfacing information and data more quickly, even helping your customers, all of that stuff is, there's amazing things you can do. But if you're not also thinking about the seatbelt, the airbag, the distractions, the things that are happening, you're just increasing the number of, I think, opportunities for problems to arise. And I think, yeah, I think that I think the two have to be hand in hand. Just the I'm not a marketer, but there should be a good way to market the security side of Agentforce that can get people to think of it as more of a complementary thing to Agentforce than something that they don't really need to worry about.
I tend to think a lot of things like security fall into the same category as public health, right? Like getting people to
Mm-hmm.
wash their hands. It's
Mm-hmm.
like it's a bit of a heavy lift. Like when we tried to get everybody to wear masks 5 years
Right.
ago, it was we had a rebellion,
Mm-hmm.
international revolts, and
Mm-hmm.
the what you mentioned up front that your data, our data is stored in various Salesforce orgs. What are the kinds of risks that really come to mind for you? What are the possibilities that would be of greatest concern for you?
I think depending on how an agent is set up and the sort of security model within that, um, you could build a poorly written flow that would surface more information than is necessary um, in a query that could possibly go to either an employee user or an external user. Those risks are probably not super high, but they're possible, right? I mean, it's just unless you really can put your data in a secure box and built your processes and flows and the automation that the agent's going to follow, um, in the proper guardrails, I think there's always going to be some risks to that. You know, I I haven't really thought too much about it, but there's all sorts of different possibilities, I suppose, that could happen. Um, I keep going back to I can't keep going back to the idea that like nothing has changed dramatically in terms of our data being accessible if it needs to be, or even if someone, even if it doesn't need to be, if someone wants it, it could be accessible, right? I think what frightens me or keeps me a little bit more uneasy about this is just that we are introducing ways to access this information more quickly without a lot of transparency on the back end about how it's getting surfaced. And so when you do that, there's just more opportunity for things to possibly go wrong. And I don't know. I'm not gonna. I'm not gonna. I don't necessarily believe we can reduce that risk to zero, just like you can't reduce getting in a car accident to zero. But I certainly think that we can do a better job of thinking about like a checklist of things to think about, and a framework for security to make sure that code in Salesforce, that automation in Salesforce, that permissions in Salesforce all sort of follow a model that minimizes the ability for accidental query to lead to some exposure of data that you don't need, that you wouldn't want happening.
And when you started out talking about, creating a flow that gives access to more information than you should, I mean, and that's, there's the issue of, using the built-in permissions in Salesforce, assigning a different profile to somebody. But then there's the layers of complexity that emerge, as you're layering on, the profiles with the flows, with whatever other automation you're using in Apex and so forth. The ability to discern where the risks might be reduces a lot. I mean, the more complicated the stack is that you've built, the harder it is to discern the risks within that. And the faster you're moving, the more complicated the stack that you're going to build.
Yeah, and I think the flip side of that too is that if something does go wrong, the more complex, the more opaque the model is, the harder it is to quickly identify what was exposing that information.
Or if the exposure even happened in the first place, like very difficult to discern.
Yeah.
When something is being misused. If there was a malicious attack, or I think we recognize that most of the world's large companies are using Salesforce in some capacity or another. And if you're an employee of Salesforce, typically is B2B, although a lot of it is B2C, presumably as well. So, when we talk about our data as to sort of random individuals in the US, our data being in, I don't know, potentially hundreds of Salesforce orgs, thousands of Salesforce orgs. Somebody's harvested from LinkedIn and made sense of who are in these different organizations. Then there's lots of these. I think of these as fairly soft targets. Salesforce orgs as fairly soft targets. That there's not a lot of tight security. As a lot of our thesis from the low-code security lines originally.
Yeah, I think the name of the game is just doing everything you can to minimize risk as much as possible. I think there's all sorts of interesting possibilities that you just alluded to about, shared LLMs across orgs. I don't, don't know what's possible, what's there, and I don't know, how how that gets, how we can determine if something goes wrong, if anyone will ever know, right? And so, there's all sorts of almost a few years ago it would have sounded like sci-fi, right? Like possibilities here, and they're becoming more and more, things to actually consider. All we can really do as professionals on the Salesforce platform, at least, is raise awareness about the difference between the security that Salesforce provides to the orgs versus what clients and customers and stewards of the orgs are responsible for protecting within like the data of the Salesforce org. And I think that gap, as we've talked about in our white paper last year, is large and murky, and I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that exists, that gap exists. And so when it comes to AI and Agentforce, I think that the same rules apply. It's just becomes more of an immediate concern because it's so attractive to get this out, to ship this, to put this in, to help your customers, to help yourself, however, that, that's in conflict with the unattractiveness of spending time going through your users, understanding who they are, what they need to see, what they should see, are they provisioned properly, all that kind of thing. But if you don't, then you run the risk of moving too quickly, I think, and really exposing potential problems later on.
When I was thinking about the vehicle fatalities and so on, the vehicle fatalities are particularly high among young people, right? Because they get their license. And what's fun and exciting about driving a car is going fast, going new places. There's the exciting aspect. Older people tend to settle into, that excitement loses its sheen, and you begin to realize that your attention is best served by being more defensive, protective.
Right. You're more you remember yourself being like a kid, and so those kids are out there, and I think you're right.
We're both having flashbacks to driving way too fast.
Yeah,
recklessly.
I never did that, but I mean, presumably maybe once or twice.
And so there's anyway. Just to summarize, I guess the gap that you were talking about, in case anybody hasn't read the Low Code Security Alliance white paper yet, is how would you describe that in brief?
I think I think there's the shared security model for Salesforce is the shared aspect of it is that Salesforce promises that they're going to protect sort of the underlying architecture and infrastructure of the Salesforce orgs. What they don't protect, or what they leave up to the individual owners of each Salesforce environment, is how you're going to protect the data that gets put into Salesforce. And protect it to the users that you want to have access to. And, I think people in the Salesforce world, we are very familiar with that. We are very familiar with profiles and permission sets and permission set groups and roles and all of the sharing rules and all the things all the types of levers that can be pulled internally. I think that the more you get outside of Salesforce in a business, the Salesforce silo in the business, I feel less sure that maybe other areas of InfoSec within a company are aware of that, the onus on the org owners to protect that data. I think like the confusion gets blurrier when people who don't use Salesforce, but maybe work at a place that does and care about security and that kind of thing, find out a little bit more about how important it is to have a model in place that you're responsible for. It's not just what Salesforce does behind the scenes.
I remember talking to one CISO, Chief Information Security Officer at a major credit union. We talked to him about Salesforce security risks, and he said, this stuff scares the shit out of me, was his actual quote. So you would say that that knowledge gap is significant. There's a significant knowledge gap between the security professionals within a company and the people who know how Salesforce works and is secured.
Yeah, I think that's probably true. I think a lot of people, I think often Salesforce lives sort of within its own world in an enterprise IT uh environment. And so, just over the last couple of years, I think it's been interesting to see, I remember one particular client where wanted to get the Salesforce teams access to GitHub, and the response was finally, like they were the only ones who hadn't been using it. And I think like sometimes Salesforce just lives on an island, for reasons I think that are understandable, but I think sometimes there's a danger in it being a little bit too separate, particularly when we're talking about the security side of things.
It occurs to me that there's multiple gaps that all sort of add up, right? There's a gap between the security professionals' knowledge of, what's going on in Salesforce and the Salesforce team. So, for example, the security professionals will have signed off during the initial purchase process, saying Salesforce does seem to provide all of the security requirements we would expect, MFA and access control list, and all these kinds of things, but they're not fully appreciating, how much Salesforce stuff is custom code. Then there's also a gap in the people working on Salesforce between their knowledge of how to configure Salesforce and their real understanding of security principles. That's another gap. And then, you said earlier that as Salesforce professionals, we understand profiles and permission sets and permission set groups and so on. I mean, I know for myself, I understand all of that very well, in theory. And if I'm shining the light of my attention on one particular situation, I can understand it very well. But say, as a consultant or somebody who's been hired in as an admin for your Salesforce org, you've got, I don't know, tens of thousands of different bits of configuration. And at any given moment, you can shine the light of your attention on a pretty small number of things, right? So there's a gap there.
Yeah. I think one thing that I've noticed is that, it's very and I think this goes to sort of the it's not super attractive space until it's a problem, right? But I think that it's rare that people start out a new Salesforce org with a clearly defined like approach to here's my users, here's what I want each type of user to see and do, and then kind of like not just move forward with that, but then document that as an institutional resource to rely on for both either the Salesforce team or the business side of it. And so, because that's seemingly very rare, what ends up happening is that the way Salesforce gets implemented is some large companies, they might have multiple different vendors come in at multiple different times over years, and that is not institutional knowledge. That is knowledge that passes through, that gets set up, and there might not be a lot of people who have an understanding or an awareness of why something was done or what was done. And if it's not documented, it's really hard to fix or really hard to make better because get into other reasons, but there's not a really easy way to kind of clean that up. And so I think the analogy that I kind of am drawn to is, I'm not the most organized person sometimes. I'll just kind of like dump my keys somewhere or my wallet somewhere and I can never find it, and or like in a big drawer full of things, and that sometimes feels like how it is like trying to figure out what gap might exist or who has access to something that they shouldn't have, because it's like all jumbled together with everything else and there's no order, rhyme or reason to it. And I think that's like an area where if you're thinking about getting into Agentforce and you're moving quickly, if you haven't thought through that before, that's where I think the two need to come in together. Like they have to be, that's one and the same. It's the same. It's part of the same solution.
So I guess if I were to summarize, that there's this underlying thought process that is critically important for for Salesforce orgs, is making sense of how to map its capabilities to what's actually needed and then keep that fresh. And that gets more challenging as you bring more consultants in over time. The older the org gets, and so the more different people are working on it. And then as things speed up with Agentforce and so forth, then that sort of mental problem becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, and that there's also this sort of negative, it's not as exciting to do the deep thinking that's required to rationalize who should get access to what, and how do we ensure negative tests on who should not get access to certain things. And it just compounds to be quite a significant amount of risk. It really does deserve significant attention.
Yeah, I think the orgs that have, like I just said, with multiple vendors that come in and sort of patchwork the organization of the Salesforce environment, that's like one extreme. And then the other extreme, though, I think is important too, like a smaller org, one that might not have partners come in to help set up. Like they might not take security as seriously because like there's just a handful of people who do it, right? And so the need to kind of separate what people have access to is less of a concern, or considered to be a concern. So it's really about, you don't want to find yourself on either end of those extremes. It's like finding the Goldilocks setup here, where you're minimizing the risk for as many people as possible.
Fantastic. Well, John, I'm really very, very grateful for the chance to think through this topic with you today, and then as well over the last year or more that we've been considering these topics and really trying to bring them into the public awareness. And I really appreciate all of the work you've done to look at Agentforce for employees and the risks there. So thank you for joining us for another episode of From Code to the Cloud, this time with John Crimmings. We'll be releasing informative conversations from industry leaders every month. And so be sure to subscribe to the show wherever you stream podcasts. You can also visit us at www.autorabbit.com for show notes, helpful links, and access to every episode as they're released. Stay safe out there, and we will see you next time. Okay.